Larry Fink created the largest asset manager in existence, BlackRock. In 2008, during the great financial crisis, the American central banking institution, the Federal Reserve, in short Fed, hired the help of Fink and his corporation to be the manager of Washington's bailout of Wall Street. In 2020, BlackRock again received 3 Fed assignments under the central bank's efforts to calm market turmoil resulting from the pandemic. The Bank of Canada and the European Union have also hired BlackRock to advise them for their programs, and 3 of BlackRock's leaders are holding key positions in the cabinet of President Joe Biden. The world's largest money manager has become such a force and developed such strong ties with the US government that William Birdfizzle, a professor of the Chicago-Kent College of Law who studies the fund industry, told, "It's impossible to think of BlackRock without thinking of them as a 4th branch of government." Beyond money management, BlackRock's software platform, Aladdin, appealed to the Fed. The program evaluates risk for clients that include governments, insurers, and rival wealth managers, monitoring more than $20 trillion in assets. It monitors millions of trades and analyzes its clients' portfolios 24 hours a day to perform risk analysis. It also acts as the central nervous system for many of the big players in the investment management industry. Vanguard and State Street Global Advisors, the largest fund managers after BlackRock, use Aladdin. Japan's $1.5 trillion government pension fund, Apple, Microsoft, Google's parent firm Alphabet, among countless others, rely on Aladdin. Aladdin apparently does not tell asset managers what to buy or sell, but let's assume that a large portion of global assets respond to the warnings Aladdin gives off. Trillions of dollars will end up reacting to events, pandemics, wars, you name it. The question is, how much do these companies rely on the software, and how many are actually using it to just help their decision-making versus make the decisions for them? So Fink and BlackRock potentially control how money is allocated towards companies through its control over the leading market analysis tool, besides its sheer financing power alone, giving and withdrawing financial aid at Fink's will, sucking all other investors within his course through the incomparable influence of BlackRock. Rats leave a sinking ship, and if the 4th branch of government decides for whatever reason that the ship is sinking by closing the flow of money, they surely will. That reason might, for example, be ideology, beyond pure economics. BlackRock in 2012 released the first of Mr. Fink's annual letters to CEOs, which have become required reading for many chief executives. He uses the letters to prod, scold, and push companies to disclose more about how they provide for workers, the environment, and the community at large. As for BlackRock, he says, it can help investors by offering funds focused on environmental, social, and governance-minded investing. In 2020, he told CEOs BlackRock would be increasingly disposed to vote against boards and companies that don't report their climate risks in formats BlackRock endorses. Mr. Fink also presses companies to disclose more on the social effects of their business, such as the welfare of their workers or their local communities. Besides climate, in 2021, Fink announces trying to push companies for greater ethnic and gender diversity for their boards and workforces, and says BlackRock will vote against directors who fail to act. Moreover, Think, back in 2018, predicts that these mentioned environment, social, governance, or in short ESG investments will be used by all investors as metrics for monetary investment 5 years from then. In other words, he uses his market power to socially engineer the culture of the nation that bears the economy. Yet for Think, or so he claims, this is just good business. He says companies attentive to societal needs wind up protecting shareholder returns. Stakeholder capitalism is not about politics. It is not a social or ideological agenda. It is not woke, he wrote. We focus on sustainability, not because we are environmentalists, but because we are capitalists to our clients. Besides, by the end of the year, BlackRock could have as many as 150 so-called exchange-traded funds, ETFs, that adhere to ESG standards. ETFs are supposed to carry lower fees than normal funds, but with ESG screening methods, BlackRock has found a way to inflate management fees. Studies show that management fees on ESG funds are more than 40% higher than other ETFs. BlackRock currently manages about $200 billion in ESG client money, which means that number is likely to grow and add to BlackRock's profits. Therefore, by pushing ESG and making it the norm for investing, and investing which is also overwhelmingly controlled by BlackRock's own algorithm, Think earns a lot of money. Be this urge for societal change really just corporate greed, or in reality the will for the ensuing results of the social engineering in itself, maybe even both? The effect still will be the same, that is social subversion and the replacement of an old culture with a new one. And it is BlackRock that thus then manages not just the economy, but the brains of whole nations, new nations they created. Often it is not at all about monetary gain that causes the robber barons to meddle in political and social affairs, but an ideological possession that wills them to shape society. They then strive for influence without the aim to earn ever more money, but to use their money to change the world and recreate it in their image instead. Enter George Soros. Soros, in his own words, admitted to play a major role ensuring separatist movements and regime change in many a nation. In May 2014, he told CNN, "I set up a foundation in Ukraine before Ukraine became independent from Russia, and the foundation has been functioning ever since and played an important part in events now." He is talking about the Maidan coup happening in the same year, ousting a pro-Russian president backed by Vladimir Putin, a constellation squarely against the wishes of George Soros, for he likens Putin and his brand of Russian nationalism to Nazism, horrendously in my opinion, for he gives no reasonable evidence for Putin's alleged view of a Russian genetic superiority, as Soros calls it. Soros wants Ukraine to be Western-oriented and tries to subvert its society to align with that aim. Other sources confirm Soros' self-declared meddling in other countries. In the same interview, host Fareed Zakaria mentions that during the revolutions of 1989, Soros funded a lot of dissident activities in Eastern Europe, like Poland or the Czech Republic. Soros did not contradict this statement. This group of national dissidents includes the Polish Solidarność, Václav Havel's Charter 77, as well as Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov, and former Georgian foreign minister Salome Zurabishvili wrote that institutions like the NGOs that gravitated around the Soros Foundation carried the Georgian so-called Rose Revolution of 2003. Whether you think that overthrowing governments that don't align to a certain political structure is justified is up to your ideological or rather moral worldview. Soros surely does think this to be good. His main organization helming his social engineering efforts, the Open Society Foundation, bragging about funding independent groups working for justice, democratic governance, and human rights, whatever these nice-sounding words will mean in reality. Yet be it what it may, what Soros or others think, the presented facts prove that multimillionaires like George Soros can and will interfere in societies in order to change them according to their desire. This meddling does not stop in Slavic or Orthodox nations. It is well within the confines of the Old West, particularly in the US. George Soros-backed groups have spent $40 million to elect 75 progressive prosecutors over the last decade, meaning 1 in 5 Americans now live in areas covered by his criminal justice reformers. In each race, Soros was the single greatest donor to the campaign. The aim of this so-called criminal justice reform, like radically overhauling bail laws and pursuing lightened sentencing, may be an effort to reduce incarceration, yet its outcome is also something else. A report by Jason Johnson, president of the pro-police action group Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, accused Soros of fundamentally dismantling the criminal justice system as we know it, replacing DAs that follow the law with radical extremists with an agenda that makes our communities less safe and emboldens criminals. According to the report, more than 30% of homicides and a third of all violent and property crimes in 2021 occurred in jurisdictions run by Soros prosecutors. In Europe, on the other hand, Soros interferes in the continent's handling of the migrant crisis. In September 2016, he said that he is giving $500 million of his non-profit organization's funds to be invested on work opportunities for migrants and refugees, especially those arriving into Europe, thus creating, in my opinion, unwittingly or consciously, incentives for the arrival of ever more refugees, but also migrants, or rather fortune hunters, onto European shores. But it goes farther than mere personal opinion. Independent research indicates that the past migrant crisis in the Mediterranean only exists to this extent because of an extensive network of open border activists and organizations behind it. Many of them are directly funded by or cooperated with George Soros' Open Society. I highly recommend reading this link, which analyzes Italy as a case study for Soros' activity in the field of European migration. So, even if furthering mass migration into Europe was not the ultimate conscious goal of Soros, still he might be, at least in part, contributing to it by him funding this network of NGOs. Officially, he wants to solve this crisis, but again, his medication more reads like a furthering of the illness, not mentioning the arrogance, or in his case, chutzpah, trying to tell foreign nations how to run their countries. I will quote from his proposal. The EU has to accept at least 1 million asylum seekers annually for the foreseeable future. The EU must lead the global effort to provide adequate funding to Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. The EU must immediately start building a single EU asylum and migration agency, and eventually a single EU border guard. Safe channels must be established for asylum seekers, starting with getting them from Greece and Italy to their destination countries, but also to extending these to the frontline region, thereby reducing the number of migrants who make the dangerous Mediterranean crossing, meaning to already take them in before they try to enter Europe. And finally, to absorb and integrate more than 1 million asylum seekers and migrants a year. The EU needs to mobilize the private sector, NGOs, church groups, and businesses to act as sponsors, without mentioning any prospect of these migrants returning, then their countries of origin are safe, by the way, or that integration is not assimilation, which, if return is not an option, will be the only humane solution for social peace, at least if the culture of the host nations shall remain in charge of their destinies. Besides, Soros, the businessman and funder of these wished-for NGOs, establishes himself to be a preeminent figure in this absorption of migrants. Must, has to, this is the language of Soros, someone who thinks he has the right to rule others. Yet for this he hasn't any other authority than his money. Of course, he cannot resist to mention another political enemy of his. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has now also produced a 6-point plan to address the crisis. But his plan, which subordinates the human rights of asylum seekers and migrants to the security of borders, threatens to divide and destroy the EU by renouncing the values on which it was built and violating the laws that are supposed to govern it. But is it really Orban who divides Europe by merely reacting, who supposedly violates its values, whatever these are, by trying to secure the well-being and cultural independence of his people? Or is it rather Soros himself who, quite literally, contributes to balkanize Europe's nations by demographically changing and thus culturally weakening their populations? Is selling your own 2 children into slavery in order to help 5 strangers whose lives will greatly benefit from the thus received money moral? Only because George Soros deems it so? Is a supposed man-made law, national or international, enabling such an outcome just or desirable? Creating, maybe unwittingly, ethnic or cultural animosity is not limited to Europe. A grant-making network founded by George Soros provided funding to some groups that engaged in Ferguson-related protest activities. In the Ferguson protests, or rather riots, of 2014, Black Lives Matter as an organization gained national recognition. In all, Mr. Soros gave at least $33 million in 1 year to support already established groups that emboldened the grassroots on the ground activists in Ferguson. while not giving money to various groups for the express purpose of promoting Ferguson-related protests and riots. The financial tether from Mr. Soros to the activist groups gave rise to a combustible protest movement that transformed a one-day criminal event in Missouri into a 24-hour-a-day national cause célèbre. Soros-sponsored organizations helped mobilize protests in Ferguson, building a grassroots coalition on the ground backed by a nationwide online and social media campaign. Of course, there is many misinformation about Soros, him collaborating with the German occupiers of Hungary in his youth, for example, while other ideas are exaggerated, like him purposefully funding racial riots or trying to demographically replace Europeans, at least maybe as a fixed plan or on a conscious level. But anyone seems to overlook that he is indeed funding action to radically change societies and to overthrow governments. It only becomes a conspiracy theory if he is criticized for it, but not if it is regarded as something positive. Larry Fink and George Soros are only two prominent examples, yet they sure are not the only ones. But their power, as any other tyrants, will eventually fall, and their designs, deemed to not have any flaws, in the end will fail, as the Logos of history is in charge of destiny, guiding the hearts of men of goodwill, and, at last, will overthrow evil.